And speaking of himself, we do have Bob Costas now on the line. Bob, this is Ryan. Thank you so much for taking some time with us to talk about the impact of Vin Scully.
Hey guys, how are you? Now, being on WFUV and talking about the Fordham legacy, understand you're talking to a Syracuse guy, but the one school that can rival Syracuse, maybe not in volume, we got a very, very long list. But when you got Vin Scully at the top of your list, and you got Mike Breen and others, you're right there. Michael Kay, you're right there. So, you have rivalries on the field and on the court. I don't know if it's a rivalry, but if you got to rank them 1, 2, somewhere in there, I guess it's Syracuse and Fordham, right?
It's a friendly rivalry, I would say.
Yeah.
It helps push each other. And so I want to, get started here. Just there's so many different ways we could go. But overall, when you look at Vin Scully's impact on the game of baseball, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I don't think this is hyperbolic to say all the great players that Vin Scully has broadcast games involving those players, none of them, and I'm well aware of who they are. We're talking about Willie Mays and Henry Aaron and Jackie Robinson, of course, and Mickey Mantle in World Series games that Vin called, and everybody through the present day. None of them were better at what they did than Vin Scully was at what he did. He was every bit as good a broadcaster as the greatest of them were baseball players. And here's the difference between Vin and any of them. None of them lasted nearly as long. None of them lasted even a third as long in their careers as Vin Scully did in his 67 years. It's not just the longevity, which is impressive enough, but the team with which he was associated, starting with the Brooklyn Dodgers, one of the most fabled teams in all of American sports history, Jackie Robinson's Dodgers, the Boys of Summer Dodgers, and then on to Los Angeles and virtually introducing Major League Baseball to Southern California. And the Dodgers have been a consistently interesting and contending team over that period of time. So from 1958 until 2010, only one primary voice of the Dodgers. The entire history of the franchise in Los Angeles during that period of time, Vin Scully was the voice. And that's the difference. Will Sandy Koufax, who's still with us, thankfully, will Sandy Koufax's name always be remembered? Yes. But since 1966, it was just a memory because that's when his career ended. But Vin Scully was not only nostalgic every time you heard him, but he was present. His broadcasts every day and every night were a combination of a news bulletin about that day or night's game, but also a flashback to every game you'd ever heard him broadcast, or every game that your dad or mom or grandparents ever took you to. No one can match Vin's ability. He's the greatest broadcaster I've ever heard. And I say that as a considered statement. And I know and have worked with and observed the greatest of the great, Al Michaels and Dick Enberg and on and on. I don't want to slight anybody. But if you have to pick one, if you have to put somebody's head above just a little bit above the others on Mount Rushmore, that's Vin Scully. But when you combine his superlative ability with the history that he spans and the longevity, there has never been another like him, including his mentor, Red Barber, including Mel Allen. And Red and Mel were the first two broadcasters to go into the broadcasters' wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame, and that was fitting. None who preceded him, none of his contemporaries, and given all the circumstances, none who follow him will ever be able to equal him. They say about somebody, he's a once-in-a-generation person, a once-in-a-lifetime person. When it comes to baseball broadcasting, I say this with assurance, even though I won't be around eventually to verify it. Vin Scully was a once-and-forever broadcaster. There will never be another to equal him in baseball.
Bob, Michael Calamari here. Thank you so much for joining us. You talk about how Vin Scully was so great as a broadcaster, and I think about the artistry that Vin displayed during his calls, Koufax's perfect game in 1965. How do you begin to explain the impeccable artistry that he displayed during those calls and so many more?
Well, you have to start out just with the talent he was blessed with. His command of language is almost uncanny, matching to the pace and rhythm of the game of baseball. He was so perfectly in sync with it. And then the instrument he was blessed with. Many broadcasters have very good voices. Vin's was not only distinctive, it was among the most pleasing voices in broadcast history. It was simultaneously exciting when it needed to be, but also comforting and soothing. And he was a wonderful storyteller. He worked at his craft. He certainly understood the dynamics of it. He understood when to speak and when not to speak. He just got all of it. So put it all together, it's like a golfer who had every club in the bag. You know, some guys are the best off the tee, or the best on the green, or the best short game. He mastered every club in a baseball broadcaster's bag. Plus, he was very good at other sports, too. He was very good on golf. He was very good on football. But baseball was the game to which he was most appropriately married.
Now, you've talked about, and I don't know how much it was a joke, how serious it was, that when Vin was telling a story, nobody ever lined into a double play. Can you kind of just go into detail how special that storytelling ability was?
Well, his storytelling ability was fabulous, and he just spin the yarn with the very best of them. And he was able to do it largely because, with the exception of the network games with Joe Garagiola, and they were a very good pair, and they adjusted to each other very well. But apart from that, most of his career on television and radio, Vin worked alone. So he was able to weave those stories in, knowing when he was going to pause, or just toss in a parenthetical aside, there's a ground ball to shortstop. So he was able to control that entire situation. But simply having that control doesn't mean that you'll do it as masterfully as Vin did. So there's that. He was just a wonderful storyteller. Plus, having been around as long as he was, and having experienced firsthand not just the events on the field, but his relationships with players and other people around the game, other broadcasters, executives, managers, writers, whatever it might be, he just had a treasure trove of stuff in his memory, and he could render it better than anyone ever has.
Bob, do you have a favorite story about Vin Scully? And if not a favorite, maybe one that just resonates with you?
Well, this one resonates with me because I was involved in a small way personally. Some 30 years ago, I was interviewing the great musician Ray Charles for a magazine piece on NBC. And at the end of this interview, Ray says to me, "You know who I'd really like to meet?" And I'm thinking, "You're Ray Charles. You're a genius in your own right. You're acclaimed everywhere. You've been everywhere, done everything. You can meet anybody you want. Who could it possibly be?" "Who is it, Ray? Who do you want to meet?" He said, "I would love to meet Vin Scully." He said, "Bob, you have to understand. To me, the picture means nothing," because Ray Charles, of course, was blind. "To me, the sound is everything." And these are his words exactly. He said, "Vin's broadcasts are almost musical. Could you introduce me to Vin Scully?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm sure I could arrange that." So eventually, we got Ray to Dodger Stadium. I called Vin and explained the situation to him. And Vin, as usual, was wonderful and gracious. And here's Ray Charles, as acclaimed at what he did as Vin Scully was at what he did. But when Vin walked into the room, almost on cue, and said, "Hello, Ray. My name is Vin Scully. What a pleasure to meet you." Ray Charles lit up like a little kid. He almost trembled with delight. And Vin was very appreciative of Ray's accomplishments, but you could tell that it was not an equal exchange. Ray was more thrilled to be around Vin. Vin was, of course, respectful and appreciative. It's Ray Charles, after all. But Ray was like a kid in a candy store.
Now, that story perfectly just personifies how unique Scully was. And just one more question for you, Bob. Really appreciate you taking some time. Another way he was unique was the broadcast ran through him, not necessarily a director. Just wondering how rare to see is that in today's broadcasting world?
Well, that's a point that I've made over the last few years when people have asked me about Vin. And to me, it's been obvious for a long time, the last 20 years of his career, when many of us would stay up late on the East Coast, to watch a Padre-Dodger game, primarily just to hear Vin call it. Modern broadcasts of every sport can be somewhat cluttered. The technology keeps advancing, and if you got a toy, it's the natural human impulse to use it. So I'm talking about guys in the truck. No matter how good they are, they got a bunch of graphics, they got a bunch of replays, you got a bunch of camera cuts. But if you watched a Dodger game over the last, in the 21st century we're talking about now, those broadcasts had a pace that suited Vin. They were directed and produced, in effect, from the inside out. Usually the broadcaster is following the pictures and appropriately trying to put a caption beneath those pictures. But they were following Vin. There was never an extraneous replay, never an unnecessary graphic. There wasn't a pitch box. They didn't show a bunch of graphics that indicate how many home runs this guy hit to left field and how many to center and how many to right, just to show off the bells and whistles. Why get in the way of Vin Scully? Why force him to acknowledge something that he didn't ask for on the screen that would only truncate something much better that he was in the midst of doing? Now, would they take a picture of some kid with an ice cream cone and the ice cream smeared all over his face? Of course they would, because they knew that Vin loved that, and he put a great caption beneath it because that was just part of what he did. But those broadcasts never got in his way, and anyone in that truck who was dumb enough to think that they were the star of the broadcast and not Vin Scully would not have been around long. Not because Vin would show him the door, but because somebody else would show him the door, because Vin was the guy. The reason you tuned in to the Dodgers was, A, to watch the Dodgers play, and not far behind, to listen to Vin Scully.
Bob Costas joining us on One-on-One. Thank you so much once again for taking some time with us.
Thank you, guys. All the best.
Thank you
Really
so much,
appreciate
Bob.
it.